The bus station was nearly deserted, the kind of place where echoes seemed louder than voices and shadows lingered longer than they should. A lone flickering bulb hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow light across rows of cracked plastic seats. Outside, the storm lashed against the wide glass panes, streaking them with sheets of water that distorted the world beyond. It was late, far too late for families or commuters. The only souls here were the stranded, the restless, and the forgotten. Among them sat a man hunched in his seat, shoulders curled inward as if trying to fold himself out of existence. His coat was too big for him, the collar turned up not just against the cold but against curious eyes. He kept his gaze locked on the floor, watching the puddles form beneath his worn boots. He had once stood at chalkboards, once filled classrooms with words meant to spark light in young minds. But now his life was nothing but silence and shadows. A former teacher, though he flinched at even the thought of the title, he didn't deserve it anymore. Not after what he had done, or rather, what he had failed to do. He carried that failure like a brand. A single student, a boy with eyes full of questions, and a home life carved out of hardship. The teacher had seen the struggle, had noticed the late assignments, the absent stares, the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves. He had told himself that he would intervene, that he would speak up, that he would be the adult the boy so clearly needed. But he hadn't. Instead, he had convinced himself to stay quiet, to let the counselors handle it, to keep his head down. And then one day the boy was gone. Transferred, they said, moved to another district. But whispers told a harsher truth. Neglect, violence, a system that had failed him. And the man who had once been his teacher bore the shame like a stone in his chest. So he left the classroom, walked away from the job that had once defined him, and shut the door on the life he had built. He became what he thought he deserved to be: invisible, a recluse wandering from place to place, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions, never daring to stand still. And tonight, fate had planted him in this bus station, with nothing but the storm outside and the ghosts inside to keep him company. He shifted uneasily in his seat, pulling his coat tighter around him, when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was the storm, the wind whistling through a crack in the glass. Maybe a branch scraping against the roof. But then it came again, clearer this time. A small, stifled sob. The kind that carried desperation, the kind that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. His head jerked up instinctively, eyes scanning the dim rows of chairs and shadowy corners. There, near the far wall, sat a boy, young, maybe 8 or 9, his clothes damp from the rain, hair plastered to his forehead. He was perched on the edge of a seat, knees drawn to his chest, trying to make himself small. His eyes darted nervously toward the doors every time the wind pushed them open, and every so often he swiped at his face with the sleeve of a jacket that was 2 sizes too big. The sobs came in bursts, quiet but impossible to ignore. The man's first instinct was to look away. Not his problem, not his business. He had no right to step into anyone else's story, not after failing so miserably the last time. But something in that boy's posture, in the way he trembled, but kept glancing at the doors as if waiting for someone who wasn't coming, pulled at him. It was too familiar, too much like the student he had failed. He shifted in his seat, his heart thudding harder than it should. He told himself to stay put, to let someone else handle it. Maybe one of the station attendants, but the place was empty. The ticket counters closed, the staff long gone for the night. The only 2 people in that wide, echoing hall were him and the boy. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the light and the storm outside. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, the man stood. His knees ached as he straightened, a reminder of how much time he'd spent curled in on himself these past years. His boots squeaked against the wet floor as he walked slowly, deliberately, toward the boy. He didn't want to scare him. He didn't want to intrude. But the sobbing stopped when the boy noticed his approach, replaced by wide, watchful eyes. "Hey." He swallowed hard, nodding. "All right, Eli. My name's... doesn't matter right now. What matters is you're not alone anymore. Okay?" The boy blinked, suspicious and unsure, but his grip on the man's sleeve didn't loosen. That small detail struck harder than any word could. It meant he wanted to believe, even if he didn't know how. The man glanced around the station, scanning for any sign of adults, of family, of anyone who might claim Eli. The ticket booths were shuttered, the vending machines humming emptily, the security desk abandoned. The few silhouettes scattered across the waiting area were drifters who looked half asleep, wrapped in their coats, uninterested in anything beyond their own survival. No one else was watching this boy. No one else cared. "How long have you been here?" the man asked. Still crouched low, Eli shrugged, his small shoulders lifting beneath the oversized jacket. "A while." That vague answer sent alarm bells ringing in the man's head. Kids didn't belong in vague answers. They belonged in certainties. Home, school, bedtime stories. Not "a while. Where's your mom or dad?" Another shrug. "Don't know." His eyes darted toward the doors again, as though hoping or fearing that someone might suddenly appear. The man exhaled slowly. He was no detective, no social worker, no hero. He was just a broken man with a past he couldn't shake. And yet, right now, none of those roles mattered. What mattered was the boy in front of him and the quiet, pleading look in his eyes. "All right," he said softly. "We'll sit together until we figure this out. Nobody's gonna bother you while I'm here." For the first time, Eli's face softened. Just a fraction. He released his knees from the tight grip of his arms and let his feet touch the wet floor. The man rose, his bones protesting the movement, and guided Eli back toward his seat. They sat side by side, the storm filling the silence between them. Minutes passed. The man kept sneaking glances at Eli, who seemed caught between exhaustion and vigilance. His small head would dip forward, then snap back up, his eyes scanning the doors as though expecting trouble. The man recognized that look. Hyper-alertness, the survival instinct of a child who had already seen too much. "You hungry?" the man asked, gesturing toward the vending machines. Eli hesitated before nodding once. The man dug into his pocket, pulling out a handful of change he barely remembered having. It wasn't much, but it was enough to clatter into the slot of a machine and return with a bag of crackers and a bottle of water. He set them down in front of Eli without ceremony. The boy tore into the crackers hungrily, crumbs scattering across his lap. The man watched in silence, not wanting to shame him for eating so fast. Hunger like that didn't come from missing just one meal. "Easy," he said gently. "There's enough." Eli slowed, chewing more carefully, though his eyes still darted, as if expecting someone to snatch the food away. The man's throat tightened again. He remembered students who had wolfed down cafeteria lunches the same way. And he remembered how he had ignored the signs, convincing himself it wasn't his place to pry. This time, he wouldn't ignore. As the boy finished eating, the storm outside roared louder, shaking the glass with gusts of wind. The man's gaze flicked toward the doors again, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement. Two figures lingering near the edge of the covered entryway, shadows barely visible in the downpour. He squinted, but a bolt of lightning split the sky, and when it faded, the figures were gone. Unease prickled at his skin. He told himself it was nothing, just vagrants avoiding the rain. But something about it sat wrong. He straightened, his instincts sharper than they had been in years. Eli noticed. "What is it?" he whispered, crumbs still clinging to his chin. "Nothing," the man lied, forcing a calmness into his voice. "Just the storm. Nothing." But inside, he knew better. The night wasn't done testing him yet. Eli leaned against him then, small and fragile, his exhaustion finally winning. The boy's head rested against the man's arm, and in that simple act of trust, something inside the man cracked. No one. But him. One of the men outside moved closer, his boots splashing through puddles. The other followed, and soon they were under the awning, sheltered from the rain but still hidden in shadow. They were waiting for something. Or someone. The man shifted again, his jaw tight. He whispered more to himself than to Eli. Not tonight. You don't get him tonight. Eli stirred faintly, his lips parting as though dreaming. The man smoothed a hand over the boy's damp hair, whispering softly, "It's all right. I've got you." But even as he said it, his pulse thudded in his ears. He had no plan, no weapon, no allies. Just a promise made in the middle of nowhere. A promise he couldn't afford to break. The station doors groaned open suddenly, pulled by the wind. Both men outside flinched, then casually glanced in, as if nothing had startled them. Their eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the man and the boy. The taller one's lips curled into something between a smirk and a warning. Then the doors slammed shut again, rattling against their frame, and the two figures stepped back into the rain, disappearing from sight. The man exhaled, only then realizing how tightly his body had been wound. His hands shook as he pressed them against his knees. He'd spent years hiding from conflict, years telling himself he wasn't built for it, and maybe he wasn't. But right now, his life wasn't the one in question. It was the boy's. That changed everything. He thought about standing, about leaving the station altogether. Maybe risk the storm, find shelter in one of the boarded-up shops across the street. But then what? Wandering blindly into the night with a child, no umbrella, no plan. While shadows trailed behind them? No. Moving would only expose them further. Instead, he leaned back, forcing himself to breathe. He would wait. He would watch. And if those men returned because he knew in his bones they would, he would stand between them and Eli. No matter what it cost. The boy shifted again, his face tilting upward in his sleep. For the first time, the man saw him not just as a frightened child, but as something more, a reminder of what he used to believe in. The potential in young lives, the futures still unwritten. The boy's trust had been given freely, almost recklessly, but it was his now, and he would not betray it. Minutes dragged on like hours. The storm beat against the windows, relentless, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, threatening to flicker out. The man's eyelids grew heavy, but he forced them open, refusing to surrender to fatigue. He'd failed before, when he let his guard down. This time, he wouldn't. At last, Eli stirred again, this time waking. His eyes opened groggily, confusion clouding them until recognition set in. He blinked up at the man and whispered, "You didn't leave." The man swallowed. "No, kid. I didn't leave." Something unspoken passed between them then, something heavier than words. It was a vow, sealed in the storm's roar, in the shadows lurking just beyond the glass. For the first time in years, the man felt a fire rekindling, a dangerous, hopeful fire. He wasn't sure he could live up to it, but he would try, and sometimes, trying was the first step toward redemption. The night deepened, and with it, the man's unease. Every creak of the old bus station echoed louder than it should have. Somewhere above, rainwater dripped steadily from a leaky pipe, each plink against the linoleum floor counting seconds he wished would vanish faster. Eli had woken fully now, rubbing his eyes, clutching the man's sleeve as if it were the only anchor he trusted. "Are they gone?" the boy asked, his voice soft, uncertain. The man hesitated. Lying to him would be easy, comforting words came cheap. But cheap words had destroyed lives before. For now, he admitted, but they might come back. Eli nodded with the solemn understanding of a child who had already learned too much about the world. His grip didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened. That tiny gesture sent a shiver through the man. Trust wasn't something he deserved. Yet here it was, offered freely by a boy who had no reason to believe in him. Footsteps. And danger outside, he realized the choice wasn't about escape, it was about resolve. He reached into his pocket and found the small metal whistle he always carried, a remnant from his teaching days. He'd used it once to control chaos in a playground, a tiny tool of authority he'd clung to long after abandoning the classroom. Now, it felt like a relic of a man he barely recognized. Still, he kept it clutched in his hand. Not a weapon, but a signal. A sound sharp enough to cut through rain and shadows. Eli noticed. "What's that?" "A reminder," the man said. "Of what?" "That sometimes even small things can make a difference." The boy nodded, though his eyes still lingered on the doors, expecting them to burst open again. Minutes dragged by. The man told Eli a story, not about himself. Those wounds were too raw, but about a boy who once stood up to bullies in a schoolyard. He described courage not as the absence of fear, but as standing tall, while fear pressed against you from all sides. Eli listened, his breathing steadier, as if the story wrapped around him like a blanket. And though the man pretended the tale was for the child's benefit, deep down he knew it was for himself too. He had failed once, long ago, when courage demanded more than he had given. He would not fail now. Outside, thunder rolled like distant drums, and somewhere in the rain, He was sure the strangers still waited. But in that fragile moment, sitting in the glow of tired, fluorescent lights with a child leaning against him and a whistle clutched in his hand, the man felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. And once a man remembers his purpose, the night has to fight harder to break him. The storm outside had grown louder, battering the station walls with unrelenting force, as if the world itself wanted to test the strength of the man's resolve. Each gust of wind rattled the windows. Each crack of thunder reminded him how fragile the thin layer of safety between them and the night really was. Eli had dozed off again, his head resting against the man's arm. But it was a light, restless sleep. Every time the wind howled, the boy twitched, his fingers tightening as if afraid he might wake up alone. The man didn't sleep. He couldn't. He sat with his back straight, ears straining for every sound that didn't belong to the storm. The drip of water, the hum of the vending machine, the creak of the old building, it all blended together. Until it didn't. A sharp metallic scrape rang from the back entrance. Not thunder, not wind, metal against metal. Someone was trying the lock. The man's chest tightened. He shook Eli gently awake. "Stay quiet," he whispered. The boy's eyes snapped open, instantly alert. The scraping stopped, replaced by the dull thud of footsteps circling the building. The man could picture them in his mind, the taller one and the twitchy one, looking for a way back in. They weren't finished, not even close. He weighed his options again. Faster this time. Run. No, the storm was too dangerous, and Eli would never keep up. Hide? Maybe. But if they got in, there was nowhere deep enough to conceal themselves. That left only one option: stand their ground. The man rose silently, motioning for Eli to follow. Together, they slipped behind the row of old ticket counters, crouching low. From here, they had a clear view of the main doors without being immediately visible. He pulled out the whistle, holding it in his palm. Small, insignificant, yet somehow it felt like a weapon, one he had to believe in, because there was nothing else. The doors shuddered. A loud bang echoed across the station as fists pounded against the glass. Eli jumped, but the man pressed a reassuring hand to his shoulder. "Stay down. Don't move unless I say so." The pounding stopped. A moment of silence followed, thick and heavy, broken only by the rain. Then came the voice, "You can't keep him forever." The words slithered through the darkness like a threat wrapped in silk. The man felt Eli stiffen beside him. "He's not yours," the voice continued. "You don't even know what you're protecting him from, but we do. Hand him over, and we'll be gone before sunrise." The man's throat burned with the weight of all the failures he carried. He thought of the student years ago, the one he hadn't been able to protect when it mattered. storm raged on, relentless, but inside the station the silence after the whistle felt louder than thunder. Eli pressed closer, his small frame trembling as though the sound had rattled his bones. The man draped an arm around him, steadying the boy and himself. His pulse still hammered, but slowly, breath by breath, he regained control. The whistle had worked for now, but he knew enough about men like those outside to understand fear was rarely permanent. They might be retreating, but retreat wasn't the same as surrender. He listened, straining past the noise of the rain. But no footsteps returned. No shadow pressed against the glass. Slowly, the night reclaimed its rhythm, the storm's roar becoming the dominant sound again. Eli shifted, his voice barely a whisper. "They're gone? For now," the man said, his voice softer than he intended. "But they might come back. Why us?" Eli asked, his eyes wide, still glistening from fear. "Why me?" The man swallowed hard. He wanted to say something comforting, something a child could cling to, but he had no answers. Truthfully, he didn't know why anyone wanted to take the boy, only that they did, and that meant he couldn't let them. "Doesn't matter why," he finally said. "What matters is you're still here." Eli's lip trembled. "I thought you were going to run. Most people do." The words landed like a stone. They were too sharp, too honest. Most people had run from him too. His colleagues after the failed exam scandal, his family when he withdrew into silence, the world when he stopped fighting to be part of it. And yes, when the boy said it out loud, he realized running was the instinct he had battled every step of this night. But not this time. Not with this boy. "I've done enough running in my life," he said at last, his voice firm. "Not tonight." Eli leaned against him again, and for a long moment they simply sat, listening to the storm. The whistle hung heavy around his neck now, no longer just a trinket from a forgotten past. It was proof of choice. A choice to act. A choice not to turn away. The man's thoughts drifted unwillingly to that student years ago, the one he had failed. He saw her face, tired and eager, showing up day after day despite struggles at home. She had asked for help, not loudly, not dramatically, but in small, fragile ways. He hadn't seen it until it was too late. And when she had slipped through the cracks, he had carried the weight ever since, convinced he was unfit to guide anyone. But tonight, as Eli rested beside him, that memory shifted. It wasn't about failure anymore. It was a reminder that he could still choose differently, even years later. The storm pounded harder, but beneath it came another sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A siren. The man's head shot up, eyes scanning the shadows. It wasn't close, not yet. But someone had heard. The whistle had carried farther than he'd dared to hope. Eli perked up too. "Is it the police?" "Could be," the man said, though he kept his voice cautious. "We're not out of this yet." Well, he rose, stretching stiff limbs, and crossed to the doors. He pushed against the glass, but it didn't budge. The old station was still locked tight. The siren grew louder, then faded slightly, as if moving past. Panic pricked at him. Would they miss the station entirely? Would they drive past, blind to the battle unfolding in the storm? He banged on the glass, hoping the sound would carry. "Here! Over here!" His voice vanished into the thunder. Behind him. "What if they don't hear us?" The man looked back at him. The boy's face, pale and anxious, mirrored every fear the man had tried to bury for years. But this time, something shifted inside him. He wasn't powerless. He wasn't voiceless. He wasn't invisible. "They will," he said, conviction threading his tone. "They have to." Minutes dragged. Then, suddenly, Flashing lights pierced the sheets of rain. A patrol car slowed at the edge of the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Relief surged through him, sharp and overwhelming. He waved frantically. Steady. He's not theirs. He's been saying not them since we got here. They tried the door. The narrow-eyed one smiled. Weary and wounded. Sir, please. The child is frightened and this gentleman is confused. He lifted a laminated card, holding it at a distance. Temporary placement authorization. The second shadow chimed in, voice soft, like a teacher's. The boy has a panic disorder. Loud sounds trigger him. Whoever blew that whistle made everything worse. He let that linger, heavy with implication. The man felt heat bloom beneath his collar. He could see the officers filing that detail away, weighing noise against child. Eli stood, small and shaking, and the man gave him a tiny shake of the head stay hidden. The boy's eyes flicked between faces like he was trying to decode a language no one had taught him. Not them, he whispered. So faint the man barely caught it. The first officer approached the doors, rapping on the glass with his knuckles. Unlock. Locked by the station, the man answered. Back hallway door is wedged, but I can pry it. Hold. The officer turned, signaling to his partner who took a few steps toward the shadows. IDs, she said. Both of you. They complied with smooth efficiency. One offered a wallet with a delicate grimace, the picture inside matching his face too perfectly like something printed yesterday. The other passed over a badge from a child services agency the man had never heard of, the lamination bubbling at the edge. The officer examined both, brows narrowing. The man saw doubt flicker but not catch. Lightning flared. Thunder stamped. And for a heartbeat, it was anyone's narrative to win. He felt the old instinct bubble up. Stay quiet. Don't make waves. Trust that the system will sort it out. That instinct had failed his student. It had failed him. He crushed it. Hard. "Eli," he said, without turning, pitching his voice so the boy could hear. "I know you're scared. Can you tell the officers one thing?" One word. The officers stiffened, the partner near the shadows setting her hand on her holster. The man kept his hands visible. "Just one word," he murmured. "Do you know a safe word?" Eli clutched his damp hoodie, throat working. The first officer leaned toward the glass. "Son, you okay?" The boy's lips parted. A single syllable pushed through. It landed like a coin dropping into a well clean, decisive, echoing its own truth. The officers exchanged a look. The partner's hand moved from her holster to her radio. The shadows didn't flinch, but the narrow-eyed one tilted his head with rehearsed confusion. "We don't use codes with him," he said quickly. "He fixates on random words." "Sir," the partner replied, voice flattening. "Stand still." She keyed her mic, calling in a code the man didn't recognize. The first officer took 2 steps back from the glass and nodded to the man. "You said there's a back hallway?" "Yes." "Emergency door jammed." I wedged it with a sign. "Show me." The man inched along the inside wall, guiding the officer by gesturing through glass, staying within sight lines. The boy shadowed him, unwilling to break contact. When they reached the far vestibule, the man pointed to the red bar door. Rain hammered its edges, making the metal hum. "If you push against the frame while I lift the wedge, we can angle it." The officer nodded, moving around to the exterior, boots splashing through a channel of runoff. The man pressed his shoulder under the crossbar, thighs braced. "On 3, the officer shouted over the storm. 1, 2, 3. Steel screamed as rusted hinges flexed. The wedge popped free into the man's palm. A wind fist punched the door wide. The officer swept in, dripping, scanning with a flashlight. "Hands where I can see them," he said automatically, even though the man already had them raised. "You stay behind me." He angled his light toward Eli. "Son, you okay?" Eli nodded, but when the officer stepped closer, the boy retreated reflexively toward the man. The flashlight found the whistle at the man's chest, then climbed to his face, drawn, wet. The officer read something there and didn't holster it. He simply dipped the beam. "Softer now. We're going to figure this out." From the front lot, the partner's voice cut in. "Dispatch." soft concern to snarling contempt. "You're making a mistake," the man spat. "You think this ends here?" The partner answered by reading rights over rain. The other suspect offered nothing but silence and a ruined badge. Backup arrived, a second unit, then a third, flooding the abandoned station with a lattice of light strong enough to make the shadows retreat to where they belonged. The officer guided the man and Eli deeper into the vestibule, away from the draft, radioing for a social worker. He kept his tone steady and procedural, but when he looked down at the boy, it softened again, like he was reminding himself of the center of this. "Sir," he said to the man, "we're going to need statements. Stay with us until Child Services arrives." "We will," the man said, and realized he meant it. "We, not I. We." Eli's hand never left his coat. The whistle hung between them, cool and solid, a proof of sound and spine. The storm raged on, but the battle line had shifted. It was no longer the world against them. It was the world with them, at least for tonight. The man let out a breath he'd been holding for years. Not the breath you take after you run, but the one you release when you decide to stand. Outside, the officers finished securing the scene. Inside, he and the boy waited, shoulder to shoulder, for the next right thing to do. And for the first time in a long time, he believed he would recognize it when it arrived. The storm began to ease, though the rain still tapped in relentless sheets against the cracked panes of the station. The fury of it had spent itself, leaving behind a gray heaviness that clung to the air. Blue and red lights pulsed across the empty lot, steady and unwavering, like a heartbeat, keeping time. The chaos of moments earlier had given way to procedure, officers moving with clipped efficiency, suspects bundled into cruisers, radios murmuring updates to a world beyond this forgotten building. Inside, the man sat on the splintered bench with Eli pressed close. The boy's breathing had steadied, but his small hands still gripped the man's coat as if afraid the world might split open again. The whistle rested against the man's chest, the chain warm where Eli's fingers clutched it. The man let him hold on. He understood that need something solid, something constant. Proof that not everything could vanish in an instant. One of the officers stepped back into the vestibule, shaking rain from his jacket. His flashlight beam skimmed across the cracked tiles before settling on them. "You both okay? We're here," the man said, his voice quiet but sure. The officer crouched to meet Eli's eyes. "You did well, kid. You stayed brave." Eli managed a nod, though his grip didn't loosen. The officer looked at the man, something measured in his gaze. "We've got them in custody." Backup confirmed those IDs were fake. Could be part of something bigger. "For now, you're safe." Safe. The word landed heavy, almost foreign. The man hadn't thought of safety as something that could belong to him in a long time. It felt fragile, like glass in his hands. He nodded, though, because the boy needed to see someone believe it. Another officer entered, carrying a thick blanket from the cruiser. She draped it over Eli's shoulders, and the boy immediately burrowed into it, his eyes half closing from exhaustion. "Social Services is sending someone," she explained. "Shouldn't be long." The man wanted to ask 100 questions. Where would they take Eli? What would happen next? Who would believe his side of the story? But the words tangled on his tongue. He had lived too long on the outside of things, too long distrusting systems that seemed to fail the most vulnerable. He swallowed those questions and instead looked down at the boy. "Hear that? Someone's coming to help you." Eli shifted, peeking up from the blanket. "You're not leaving, are you?" The question pierced straight through him. He had no ties here, no official role. He was nobody in the eyes of these officers, just a man who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. Yet in this child's eyes, he was something else. Something he hadn't dared believe he could be again. "I'm here," he said softly. I'll stay until you're safe." The boy leaned into him, finally releasing the whistle chain. The one he hadn't fought hard enough for, and wondered what it would have been like if someone had written down her story, her truth, instead of letting it disappear. Eli tugged at his sleeve. "Will you come with me?" The man looked at Miss Carter, uncertain. She studied them both for a long moment, then gave a small nod. For tonight, yes, he can come. It wasn't a forever answer, but it was enough. As they prepared to leave the hollow station, the man cast one last look at the shattered door, the rain-slick floor, the whistle at his chest. It had begun as a night of shadows, of storms, of memories clawing at him like ghosts. Now, it felt like the first chapter of something different, not absolution, but the fragile beginnings of redemption. He tightened his arm around Eli and stepped into the rain, not as a fugitive from his past, but as someone finally willing to face forward. The ride in Miss Carter's car was quiet, the storm fading into a steady drizzle outside. The wipers squeaked rhythmically against the windshield, a small, ordinary sound that felt strangely comforting after the chaos of the night. Eli sat buckled in the back seat, wrapped in his blanket, his head leaning against the man's arm. Every so often, the boy's eyes fluttered, as though sleep wanted to take him, but then he would jolt awake, glancing around in fear that he might find himself alone. Each time, the man gave a reassuring squeeze of his shoulder, "I'm still here," he whispered. "Go ahead. Rest." The boy never fully surrendered to sleep, but the tension in his frame eased little by little. The man stared out the window, the passing lights blurring into streaks across the glass. His reflection stared back at him, lined, tired, and older than he remembered being. He thought of how far he had fallen since the days of chalk dust and lesson plans. He had been a teacher, once, meant to guide, to protect. Yet for years, he had believed himself stripped of that purpose, undeserving of it. Tonight, with Eli curled against him, the possibility flickered back to life, fragile as a candle flame. Miss Carter drove with steady hands, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every so often, not in suspicion, but in quiet observation. She seemed to sense the delicate balance between them. At one red light, she spoke, her voice calm, almost like a teacher herself. "There's a temporary shelter for families not far from here. They keep a wing open for emergency cases like this. Eli will be safe there until we can make longer-term arrangements." The man nodded, though his throat tightened. Shelter. Safe. Words meant to comfort. Yet all he could picture was the boy alone in a room full of strangers, clutching a blanket that couldn't replace arms. He swallowed hard. "And me?" he asked before he could stop himself. Miss Carter glanced at him in the mirror, her gaze measured. "You'll give a statement. The officers will want details. After that," she hesitated, then said gently, "That part isn't up to me." As Wes, he leaned back, silence filling the space. He didn't deserve a role in the boy's future, that much he knew. He had his own shadows, his own mistakes, but still. The thought of walking away left an ache that hollowed his chest. When they arrived, the shelter loomed quiet against the night, its windows glowing warmly in contrast to the storm-dark streets. Inside, volunteers moved softly, speaking in hushed tones, carrying clipboards and cups of tea. The air smelled faintly of soap and bread. It was not a home, but it was not a place of fear either. Miss Carter guided them to a small sitting room with faded couches and a rug worn thin at the edges. Eli refused to let go of the man's hand as they sat down. A volunteer appeared with a mug of cocoa, setting it on the table in front of the boy. Eli looked at it but didn't drink, his gaze flicking nervously between the cup and the door. "You're safe here," Miss Carter said softly, kneeling to meet his eyes. "No one can get in without us knowing. You'll have a bed, and in the morning, we'll talk about where you want to be." Eli nodded faintly, then turned to the man. "You'll stay?" The man's heart twisted. He looked at Miss Carter, who hesitated, then sighed, as if weighing rules against compassion. "For tonight," she said. "One night." You stayed, he whispered. I told you I would. The man replied, his voice rough but steady. For a moment, neither moved. Then the boy threw himself forward, wrapping thin arms around the man's neck. The hug was fierce, desperate, almost as though Eli needed to confirm that this protector was still real. The man froze, stunned by the weight of trust in that small embrace. Slowly, carefully, he brought his arms up and held the boy close. It was awkward at first. He hadn't held anyone in years, but then something broke loose inside him, and the gesture became natural. Across the hall, Miss Carter stood with a clipboard, watching. She smiled faintly, the corners of her eyes softening, but she didn't interrupt. Some moments were too rare to disturb. When Eli finally pulled back, his face was serious. "What happens now?" he asked. His voice was small, but the question carried the weight of a child who had lived with too many uncertainties. The man glanced at Miss Carter, who stepped forward. "What happens now," she said gently, "is we figure out the best place for you. Somewhere you'll be safe, cared for, and given the chance you deserve." Setting seven starred, Eli's eyes flicked back to the man. "Can he come too?" The man's throat tightened. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise forever. But promises were heavy things, and he had already broken too many in his life. Before he could speak, Miss Carter crouched down to Eli's level. "That's something we'll talk about. What matters is that you're not alone anymore." The boy seemed to accept that, though his hand found the man's again and didn't let go. The man squeezed back, as if to say without words, "No matter what happens, you matter to me." Later, after breakfast and forms and conversations with officials, Miss Carter pulled the man aside. "You know," she said, "redemption doesn't always come in one sweeping act. Sometimes it's in the quiet things, staying through the night. Being the face a child looks for first in the morning. Those things change lives too." 7. The man lowered his gaze, emotions swirling. "I don't know if I can change everything I've done." "No one can," she replied. "But you can change what you do next." He nodded, words failing him. Still, as he glanced back at the boy, who was chatting shyly with another child over toast, a strange warmth spread through him. He realized he wanted to try not for himself alone, but for the boy who had chosen to trust him when he least deserved it. Before leaving, Eli ran to him, wrapping his arms around his waist this time. "Don't forget me," the boy said, his voice muffled against the man's coat. The man bent down, placing a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Not in a million years," he said softly. "You're the reason I remember who I used to be, the part that was good, the part I thought was gone." The boy looked up at him, eyes bright despite everything. "I won't," the man promised. And this time, he believed himself. As he walked out of the shelter, the morning air crisp against his skin, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of possibility. The world outside was still rough, still full of storms and shadows. But inside him there was a shift. He had been given a second chance, not by circumstance or luck, but by a child who had simply asked him to stay. He paused on the steps, breathing deeply, letting the light wash over him. For the first time since the day he walked away from his classroom, he felt like a teacher again. Not in the old sense of standing at a blackboard, but in the deeper way of guiding, protecting, showing by example that people could choose to be better. And though he didn't know what lay ahead, one truth settled in his heart. Redemption wasn't found in erasing the past. It was found in being present when it mattered most. Somewhere inside the shelter, Eli's laugh rang out, clear and unbroken. The man smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached his eyes. He turned and walked down the street, not as a man fleeing his failures,